So, my piano suite. Years worth of work, if you can believe it. Which, when you think about things like symphonies and whatnot, really not that much, but to me it felt like a lot. But yeah, so titled Arcadia. Um, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But this is definitely, I know we all often we always give ourselves like we always like, and I'm definitely no different. We always kind of give ourselves a little bit of crap about like, oh, my music sucks. And honestly, I think that's because I think my music does suck, but this one sucks a little bit less. So yeah, so I've already mentioned this a couple times, but it started out as this kind of, I started writing it in December of 2019 over Christmas break, just because I actually wanted to compose for fun, if you can believe that. It's a very foreign emotion to me now, but but yeah, so I was just like, I just want to, I haven't written a piano piece in a little while, which is, not really that long because I write too much piano music according to Dr. Stenson. Um, but yeah, so I started writing it over Christmas break, and I'd written about like 4 movements by the time spring semester rolled around. And around that time, I was starting to get to know Aaron. He just graduated last semester with a bachelor's in piano performance. He is amazing. We had interacted a little bit prior to us, really, but we really hit it off. Kira actually was in MTC 312, was where we really hit it off. And yeah, so we bonded over Lansing's homework, and anyway, so he and I started interacting more and more, and next thing you know, he'd heard the third movement. He'd heard because just like when we've been talking, he had heard me like mention the third movement of the suite because I was working on it. He's like, "Can I hear it?" So I played it for him. He's like, "Dude, I really want to play this. This looks like so much fun." So he was gonna play it in an SCI concert, but then that was right when COVID hit. So to kind of make up for it, he kind of reached back out to me and was like, "Can I commission you for this?" And he's like, "I will like take this piece, on tour and do all kinds of things with it." And when he says those kinds of things, he means it. So next thing you know, 3 movements turned into 5, 5 turned into 7, and then 7 turned into 8, unexpectedly right at the very end. But yeah, so it very much kind of blew out of proportion, for better or for worse. And I pretty much, the moment he and I like agreed to that he commissioned it, we were working like right next to each other. So I mean, I would like check in with him like every week or so. So it definitely became my piece that I was going to be using for graduate applications, and then also for senior recitals. So obviously for my senior recital, but then Aaron also wanted to do it on his recital. Unfortunately, what ended up happening was he kind of overbooked himself, and I was like finishing the piece a little bit too last minute, and so he was only able to play movements 1 through 6, and then he had like a week or so to learn 7 and 8 for my graduate school applications. So the recording that you guys will hear tonight is not like, he will say it's not him at his best. It's still really freaking amazing, but it's not going to be anything close to what you'll hear on the recital. But either way, still really, really good recording. Still definitely works as proof of concept. So I kind of envisioned this, because I had written so much piano music, as kind of a compilation of everything that I had been working with musically, compositionally, these past 4 years. It did not start out programmatic, but it did become programmatic. And I very much, I was like trying to think of a way. I wasn't originally going to write a poem to describe the program, but then when the program got so specific, I realized I got to find some way to explain this. I like to write. So hence I went and wrote a poem about like a week or so after I finished the piece. So I'll just kind of briefly go through this. So everyone knows I like early 20th century music. But I've been listening to a lot of Baroque music this past year, particularly the Bach French and English suites. And that kind of got the idea of the dance suite in my head. I'd really been wanting to work with like miniatures, particularly different like classical forms, and do my own twist on them. And so so that was kind of like already in my head by the time I started the piece. I was like, okay, I'm gonna work with, a toccata, a gigue, intermezzo, whatever. And then you combine that with all the 20th century music I'd been listening to, which was very kind of pastiche, neoclassical. Specifically, the Ludus Tonalis had a huge impact on it because of the Hindemith's harmony was very much in that kind of vein of where I was kind of shooting for with my own harmony. The Aaron showed me, I listened to the Barber Piano Sonata for the first time, like about a midway into the spring semester. Aaron showed it to me, and the fugue from that single-handedly almost inspired my fugue in the suite. And then similar with Schoenberg's Gigue and his, the first 12-tone piano suite that he did. But then also I list, of course, when we think pastiche, particularly postmodern pastiche, Rockberg, there's definitely a lot of that. And then also Carl Vine, I don't know how many of y'all know him. Australian composer, really, really good. Very much famous for taking these like rapid mood shifts in the like almost like making a single long movement work, so like 13 minutes or so, and dividing it up into little miniatures within the 13 minutes. So that kind of, while I didn't do this idea of like a big long piece with an overarching narrative, but with individual contained segments. And then I didn't realize that Tabazadas had a piece called Arcadiana when I was titling mine, but it's there. And they actually don't have, he's much more on the just like trying to depict idyllic utopian kind of, he's more like trying to use it in the traditional sense. And I'll get to that in a second. And then the other big influence, of course, heavy metal is always a thing with me, particularly Animals as Leaders this past year. They're kind of they're interesting. You should check them out. They the lead guitarist, he's very famous for using this kind of thumping technique with his thumbs. They use like these like 8-string guitars, and he thumps back and forth on the bottom 2 strings. But I'd reread Paradise Lost, and I'd listened to the Symphony X concept album. They're another prog band. I'd listened to their concept album, also titled Paradise Lost. So I had very much had these kinds of, motifs of, sorry, I see there's the chat's blowing up. Let me get that on screen.
Sorry, Wesley, it's not for you.
Oh, of course he's here. But yeah, so I had those kinds of themes running in my head when I was getting started on this. So I mentioned it a little bit before. What is Arcadia? It's kind of it started out, it's a region in Greece. I actually don't know if it's still a region. Maybe like it's based off the historical region. You can say it's still a place, but I don't know if like it's not like a legal region or whatever. But it very quickly, the people there were very much, it was like very idyllic wilderness, lots of shepherds, etc. And later the Renaissance utopian idealists kind of adopted this term as kind of a byword for Eden or utopia, but specifically focusing on the humans being at harmony with nature, this kind of peaceful, untouched by modern concepts society. Very much like it really came into play when industrialization hit. And the big difference between it and like traditional utopia is that traditional utopia is seen as being something that we can actually physically achieve, at least in the Renaissance they thought they could. Arcadia is very much seen as unattainable, something that's kind of been lost. So that was how I decided to use it. So I started writing, as I mentioned, I started writing movements 1 through 4 between December and March of 2020. I had to take a little bit of a break because of various other things, COVID, stamps piece that I had to do. I don't know how many of y'all remember that. But then movements 5 through 8, I got started kind of later that semester, right towards the end, and I finished in November 2020. So I want to give a little bit of an anecdote. My roommate Mac is probably I've told Kira and a few other people some anecdotes about my crazy roommates. Anyway, they're not at all musical. They're both one's in mechanical engineering, computer engineering, and one's marine science. But and so Mac has very much often expressed his, how much he doesn't like classical music, and very much has made fun of me for, tongue-in-cheek made fun of me for it. But one time he had a few drinks in him, but he said, "I really want to listen to your piano suite." And surprisingly, he actually liked the music of it, which I was prepared for the worst. But he said, where I had a problem with it was actually with the program. And I'm like, interesting. So we talked about that for a little while. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how bleak my program is. So I'm going to be very curious to get y'all's opinions on that. I mean, obviously, and so my point with that, and where I want to kind of segue, is there's this idea of delayed reflection of life. When I was writing this piece, I don't think I was very much like Tchaikovsky with his Pathetique symphony, and Rockberg with the string quartet with his son's death. I was not in a bad frame of mind when I was writing this. But about a year prior, it had been kind of, especially with sophomore year being so difficult, we'd had a few deaths in my family. So that there was that kind of thinking about it. And then when you take into thought that I was writing the first 4 movements over Christmas break, so time to think, and I was writing the latter several movements during quarantine, so I'd had more time to think, that I think those negative thoughts just kind of came back up. And so that might have influenced the trajectory of the program, because as you'll see when we read the poem, it very much starts out optimistic and very quickly spirals down. So yeah, so that's kind of just something that, and especially too, I mentioned this on the slide too, the fact that Christmas break was more of a positive time of reflection, and then quarantine was more of a negative time of reflection. Maybe not as bad as, not as bad of warranting this kind of program, but bad enough that it brings back up negative thoughts. So just something to be thinking about when you're composing is, what kinds of ideas and emotions and are coming up, and where are they coming from, and what particular time. So yeah, so here's kind of the overall trajectory of it. We take this idea of Arcadia, utopia, and we have this idea, this dream of it. Then we take steps to create such a society in practice, but human nature, the bastard or bitch that it is, very much gets in the way and kind of ensures that the foundation of the society is flawed from the outset. People celebrate, we've achieved perfect society, woohoo. And then there's this kind of moment of reflection in the middle where some outsider kind of sums up what has gone on, and kind of laments for what is to come, the inevitability of the foundation collapsing because it was flawed from the outset. Society motors on, but then something bad happens, and then everything falls apart. Everyone turns on each other, and it just collapses into nothingness. And then we have this big kind of surveying of the ruins, and then the dream returns, the optimistic dream we had from the beginning, it dies. And then, but from the ashes, there is this kind of hope for maybe achieving utopia at some other point, So very, very, very dismal. So that's why I think, I didn't think about when I was writing it, but when, my non-musical roommate brought it up, I realized, oh, wow, that's a little dark. But so anyway, so a little bit of kind of that's okay, John. Don't worry about it. I also have been very scary looking lately with the beard getting kind of wild. So anyway, a little bit about my process, or my compositional process. I am very mechanical, and so I start out, I love improvisation. So I start out with an idea that's usually based from me improvising on the piano or the guitar. But then I take it through all kinds of counterpoint, layering, motivic development, thematic transformation, all these kinds of really and I'm very rigid with my voice leading and my harmony and whatnot. It's almost like pseudo Bachian Renaissance, etc. I can't see all of y'all very well. Oh, there we go. Now I can see people. So yeah, so that's kind of how I start. And that's how this piece, oh, whoopsies. That's how this piece started. But what I noticed was, because I love improvisation, there's very much this idea of forcing the program down the listener's throat that kind of rose up within me. I was like, I really like with my music of, I go through all these, you know, processes, and I come up with this image in my head of what the music is supposed to represent. But the audience can come up with something completely different. The performer can come up with something completely different. I like that. But here I am, and I have this really, really intricate piece, and I have this really, really intricate, detailed program. And I'm like, I'm kind of shoving it in your face and saying, this is what you need to interpret. And you know, it's been a kind of a question, you know, since the dawn of classical music of, you know, are we allowed to do that? And it definitely hit me at this point. So I kind of came, because, you know, and especially too with processes, the audience doesn't perceive it past a certain point. Particularly in the case of, like, you know, really, really intricate motivic development and thematic development. You just, unless you're looking at the score and you're studying it, you're not going to notice it. So yeah, so I was kind of grappling with that. And the other thing that also came into the equation was, like with my roommate, some people may take issue with the program. So, and that sometimes, especially if it's a performer, that might limit the exposure of the piece. You know, they may say, I don't like this program, I'm not going to play this piece. So the decision that I came to with it was that the program is optional and left to the decision of both the performer and the audience. I say in the program notes up front, you don't have to read the poem. I say to the performer in the performance notes, you don't have to include the poem with the program if you don't want to. Like, you don't have to even put it in the notes. And that actually kind of worked out well with a lot of the other things that I was doing in the piece. So for instance, I included some variable tempi. You know, I basically set, like, I picked a setting on my metronome, and then I gave like 2 clicks out in either direction. And that you can choose from any metronome marking within that range. And another thing that I did was, sometimes I would, like, I do this in a lot of pieces. I have so many different themes and motives going on at the same time that it's impossible to bring out all of them in a way that people will internalize. And so the performer has to make a decision. You know, do I want to bring out this theme, or do I want to bring out this one? And I'll tell you, specifically with this one, it's like specific famous themes that have been kind of established up until now. So yeah, so I ended up kind of leaving things a little bit vague in regard to the kind of the way the piece is supposed to be handled, despite it being this very intricate, you know, process-oriented piece. But that being said, we're composers. This is me talking about the piece. I'm absolutely going to talk about my process in detail. So yeah. So here's the poem. I'll read it through real quick. Again, keep in mind, I wrote this after I had already finished the piece. So but the ideas were already it was already pretty much set in stone. Like, you know, about like 2/3 of the way through me writing the piece. So, a dream, born of ideals and burdened with purpose, upon which rests an ambition that can only be called human. All great journeys begin with but a step, though not all roads should be traveled, and some dreams should stay dreams. Arcadia, known to some as Eden, heaven on earth, lofty desire. For those spawned of dust, it is the yearning, compelling their being. For this reason, they strive to recreate heaven. A foundation is laid, a clockwork construction, cracks in the cogs, for the dream was flawed from the start. Hubris, false stance of greed, as the dust children greet their creation with joy. Yet unbeknownst to them, the cracks widen, nature and ambition corrode, and the dream starts to silently crumble, while the drunk masses writhe and stomp their feet. Wordless lament for that which is to come, an outside view, a higher perspective, reveals the tragedy at heart. For the dream was born from a need to complete that which was lacking, but such is the essence of life, to fall short where it matters most. Machine, the engine runs as it was intended. Hidden seeds sown, portents ignored. Calamity strikes and breaks the facade. Pick up the pieces to reclaim what was lost. 'Tis for naught. Tragedy rears its head, and death bells toll. Ruination, the dream crumbles to dust from whence it came. Ideals tarnished, morals renounced. Brother turns on brother, mother abandons child. Hubris cackles in victory, and humanity pays the price. A dirge, desolation, left to face death alone. Monument to the hopes and sins of those who tried to recreate heaven. On earth it is impossible, for all journeys are haunted by the specter of human nature. Forgotten dream, a flicker, reminder of good intent at heart. But death awaits, all things must end. Yet from the dream's ashes, through love and grace, beyond this life, we reach our true Arcadia. So, and I want to go back for a second too. One other thing too that I also forgot to mention to you, so I am a Christian, but I really don't, I'm Episcopalian, and we often call ourselves like, kind of, it kind of bothers me that we call ourselves this, but we call ourselves the thinking man's denomination. So, but at the same time, there is a side of me, I don't like shoving my religion in people's faces, because of that's very right, yeah. So I was kind of a little uncomfortable because of the deaths, specifically the person that I dedicated this piece to, my godmother. She died right before it was like as it was being finished, and she was very, very invested in the piece and in what I've been doing. She was like a second grandmother to me, basically, and she's very religious. So I kind of felt, especially when losing her at the moment that I finished the piece, just felt very, so there is kind of, at least, especially in the poem, there is a religious bent, especially a Judeo-Christian bent with the, through love and grace beyond this life, that whole thing. So that was another reason why I wanted to leave the program optional, just in case. Now, obviously, you can interpret this multiple ways. There is the thought of like, reincarnation and whatnot, but, because I did end up making that decision to add a little bit of a religious bent to it, that's even furthered my decision of saying optional. So let's talk about the actual music now. So 8 movements. I titled each one the start of the poetic stanza. So each stanza from the poem corresponds to the particular movement. And I realized I didn't talk about the poem that much. I don't really have like that much of a process when I write poetry. It's like I was going for 8 lines per stanza, 8 movements. Balance. I was kind of trying to balance some numbers of syllables and to make it have this like speech-like cadence. And then like these line breaks that were a little bit, kind of trying to, break up the lines in the middle. But other than that, I just kind of freewheeled it. But so based off the poem, I kind of came up with a couple of different interpretations of how to structure the piece. And this is also based off of interactions I've had with Aaron as he was learning it. So there's definitely a kind of, literary mountain, exposition, rising action, climax, and then denouement. There's definitely that kind of thing going on here, especially if you've read the poem. But there's also these, as you'll see when you listen to it, all the movements are kind of paired with another movement. So for instance, the canon and the fugue use the same kind of theme, and the fugue gets a little bit more elaborated. Same thing with the gigue and the cont, and the intermezzo and the sarabande. And then the toccata and the epilogue share some stuff. The intermezzo also kind of shares a few themes. So based off that, you get these 2 distinct halves, where the first 3 main body movements, the canon, the gigue, and the intermezzo, are kind of reflected by the fugue, cont, and the sarabande. And then the toccata and the epilogue, because they share some motivic similarities, they kind of function as an intro and a coda. However, all of the movements, these particular movements start a tocca, so they segue seamlessly into each other, which kind of upsets that notion of oh, the Toccata is an introduction, but it feels like it goes right next into the, you know, and especially the Sarabande and the Epilogue. I actually almost wasn't going to write the Epilogue. The Epilogue was the one I pretty much tacked it on after my godmother died. And it was like the Sarabande was getting too long, and I needed to figure out, okay, well, I've got all this extra music here at the end. Fine, it's another movement. And so they ended up being a Toccata. And that really messes with the idea of, okay, where's this, are we ending? You know, so that kind of made me think a little bit more about, okay, here's the structure. And this really kind of reflects the nature of what's going on, especially with the latter three main body movements kind of being a reflection, like a distorted, you'll see when we get into the themes, all of those 5, 6, and 7 movements are like distorted, twisted versions of kind of the first of 2, 3, and 4. And then so then it kind of is like a hybrid of this poetic narrative meets musical narrative of, you know, themes and motives versus poetry and narrative drama. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of the piece. So then I can talk about the themes. So this was the this first one right here, and I'm going to pull up iTunes for this just so you can hear them. This thing, I called it the Arcadia theme. This is the basis for most of the piece. As you can see with the fugue, it's kind of a elaboration on it. It definitely represents the idea of like utopia, but as we know, as you saw with the poem, that kind of quickly takes a nosedive, and so it disappears from the piece fairly early on, only to come back later in kind of like a twisted format before we finally get it like corrected by the end of the piece. And then the fugue is kind of a twisted version of it. It also features very much in the towards the end. Basically, once something gets introduced, it gets kind of spun out. Typical, you know, motivic development. Then I call it the Hubris theme. It's introduced in the Gigue. It's this kind of running bass line. And let me actually play. Let me play the Canon. So tell me if y'all can hear this. Good. Okay. Yeah, so that's it. That's the Arcadia theme. And then here is the fugue, which is, like I said, an elaboration of it. And it's just that bit. The subject goes on. That's it, because it's obviously it's got like a head and a tail, but the head of the fugue subject is the Arcadia bit. And then here's the Gigue theme. And then it repeats. But that's the important bit, those first 3 measures, and then the kind of little hiccup at the end. And then we have the cont, which it's a little harder to tell because there's a bunch of other stuff going on top of it, like in addition to that, but it's this. You know, you can kind of hear the little metrical, and I kind of cut it off, but you can hear the little like metrical hiccup towards the end that's kind of representative of the Gigue. It follows it kind of more in contour than it does in actual notes, but you can see like the intervals of where it kind of jumps are similar. So yeah, that one was basically meant to represent kind of human achievement, you know, pride, and then eventually that when it turns into kind of, you know, megalomania, narcissism, perverse pride. So yeah, and then there's also a couple of like other lesser important themes. The one that starts the intermezzo, it's kind of an inversion of the Canon theme. And then there's the opening gesture of the Toccata, which I use in a few places. And then finally, the fugue counter subject doesn't really get used all that much, but it does. It's probably like the high point of tension in the piece where it does make its appearance. So for that reason, I often like to include it, because it's kind of like it gets this really. I remember Dr. Hyman, the first time she heard the passage that I call the calamity, she was like, "That was terrifying," and I was like, "I think it's pretty metal," you know. But so yeah, so let's see. I'll just because I'll kind of go through this pretty quickly, just because I know I don't want to keep you guys Calamity Ganon, yeah. But what was it? I don't want to keep you guys too long, especially because the piece is fairly lengthy, and I do want to listen to the whole thing. But yeah, so we've already talked about the program for the toccata. This is the dream portion of the piece. But basically, what I did is I used that Arcadia theme as kind of like, I broke it down into this pitch set, and I made harmonic areas based off of that. And I actually, I had this grandiose notion in my head of each movement being in a harmonic region to spell out the Arcadia theme. So like the first movement being an F sharp. So if we go back to the, so it's G flat, E flat, B flat, A flat, G, A, F. I was like, first movement's going to be an F sharp, aka G flat. Second one's going to be an E flat. Third one's going to be in B flat. Second one's going to be in G sharp, aka A flat. And I kind of got there, but then it kind of like fell apart a little bit towards the end because you actually have to pay attention to the music. But yeah, so yeah, there's also these like dark chords in the lower register. Those are, I was thinking kind of in my head, ominous. And then in terms of how it relates back to that Baroque dance suite that I was talking about, toccata, touching the keyboard, warming up our fingers. So you've got these, and it's often very much improvised. So you have these kind of fast improvisatory runs. And then something just to be on the lookout for is I kind of leave the motif that opens the piece unfinished. And at the end of the movement, it attacas into the Arcadia theme, the canon. I do it again at the end, at the start of the epilogue, and this time it's like the completed version of it. So a little small detail, but so the canon basically is kind of the main like meat of the first half in terms of introducing stuff, because I use obviously I use the Arcadia theme, but I use its inversion a lot throughout the whole piece. So it's a canon at the octave, very, very strict. I don't think I did any kinds of like alterations or whatever whenever I brought them in. But it starts out like top of the piano, and it gradually moves all the way down to the bottom of the piano. Goes from E flat, kind of an E flat major-ish territory, to an E flat minor, and then from a B flat major to a B flat minor, which is the key of the Gigue. And so one thing I've kind of been coining this term, which is always dangerous when you start coining terms in music, but I call it polyscalar, just because I've used it on a couple of different pieces, where I take a theme or a motive and I kind of think about it in terms of what scale am I using at the moment. So for instance, the Arcadia theme starts out in E flat minor, kind of goes to E flat major, and then it has this kind of Lydian whole tony thing. And the reason why that's important is because then you get this, when you're adding voices underneath it, you get different kinds of harmony. So what sounds like it might be, well, one part of the piece is in E flat minor, something else might be in more whole tone, and then another voice. And so it creates this big multi-layered kind of collage of different harmonic systems. So it's a nice way of helping me kind of visualize what I'm doing with a given motive or theme at any point in time. The last bit's not really important. You'll see that. The Gigue is one of the most straightforward ones. This is one that Aaron really, really liked right off the bat. It's very much kind of straightforward. Like I write a lot of stuff that's kind of in this vein. Odd time signatures, layering voices on top of each other. The only other thing that might it kind of is a little bit of a callback to earlier movements is the middle section, which has this kind of like floaty pedaled section. Aaron really brings it out. You'll hear it in the recording, but kind of hints back at the harmony of the toccata. The intermezzo. This one's a pretty important one in terms of because this is kind of the halfway point, the turning point. But basically, it turns into this it starts out with this kind of lyrical version of the theme, the Arcadia theme, and then it turns into this Brahmsian. If you've ever listened to the Brahms, like the A major intermezzo, and then a couple of others, he's very much about this 2 against 3 triplets against melody in the right hand. And then I turn it into a duet. the other most important part about this is the lament bass line that I introduced at the end, another Baroque callback, where, because the lament the lament bass line that's used here it comes back in the Sarabande, but it also is used as the harmonic regions that the fugue modulates to, kind of loosely. And you can read about the harmony. That's it. It's just, yeah, I was kind of like, I felt a little guilty about it, but I wrote the first part of this technically in A sharp. Now I did the key signature was G sharp minor, but I wrote the first part, it's like seemingly in A sharp because we're coming from the Gigue, which is in B flat minor. Yeah, so the fugue's whack. It's basically, we take that Arcadia motive and we just we go to town with it. And what's interesting is after the exposition, so after all four voices are in, it kind of cuts off abruptly. And then we transition into this sonata form like development that ends up in this big tumultuous, I mentioned it earlier, the calamity bit that's based off of the counter subject. And then we enter into kind of more of like a recap, like sonata form, but now it goes back to being more of a fugue. And it ends kind of abruptly with these like ominous tolling funeral bells, signifying that society is about to fall apart, which is what happens in this one. So basically the Courant, pity the pianist. One fugue back to back with this one's not easy. Aaron, honestly though, he learned this one like really, really fast. It blew me away because he was like, this one's gonna be hard, and I'm like, I know it is, and he's like, oh, not that bad, not that bad. But basically, you take all these major themes from earlier, and you're just kind of layering them on top of each other, with the melody from the Gigue just kind of like poking in the background. And believe it or not, it's actually like completely tonal. It doesn't sound that way when you first perceive it, but Aaron and I were talking about this. When you listen to it enough, you just F minor is just like beaten into your skull, even though it's so chromatic. And the other thing that's also worth mentioning about it is it also, in terms of how it relates back to the Baroque Courant. So the Courant is kind of a French, Ian, our resident historical performance specialist, I think I'm being right about this. So the Courant's a French variant of the Courant, and it's a little bit faster, and it's a little bit more like, there's usually more of like a running 16ths or something like that, versus the Italian, which is a little bit slower. Am I right about that? I think so.
I think you have it backwards.
Oh, dadgummit. I could have sworn
French,
that.
Your pronunciation is also atrocious.
I'm sorry. Wait.
Okay.
I'm from Alabama.
Courant and corrente. Okay, but yes, corrente. You have the characteristics of them. You just flip them in your head.
I'm going to look that up later because I think that I do my research. I'm pretty sure, because I was actually surprised that the Courant wasn't the fast one. The Courant. You have to forgive me.
Either way, it's impressive that you know there's a difference.
Yes, no, because I did my research for this. But yeah, it's a big extended 1-4-5. Aaron and I were joking about it. It's like, oh, it's just blues, but it goes from F minor to B flat minor and then to C minor. The Sarabande is similar to the Courant, just a big collage. It's probably the most motivically complex, and this is the one where I was talking about, where the performer has to really make decisions about which one you're going to bring out, because you'll have, like, at a given point in time, especially if in the introduction, you have the Arcadia theme in one, you have the intermezzo theme in another, you have the Gigue in another, and then you've got, like, it's all four things equal importance. You have to decide which one to bring out. It also relates back to the Baroque with the it's a very augmented, slowed down version of the the Handel Sarabande, the dun 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 dun, very slowed down version of that. But then I actually take it and I fit it into 11/8. I was just reading the chat. But yeah, I fit it into 11/8, and so there's like all these hang-ups over the bar line. You have this strong kind of 11/8 rhythm, but then you have the melody being in the typical Sarabande rhythm. Yeah, it's okay. And then so anyway, so yeah, so it kind of the Sarabande just kind of keeps going. It's very definitely the one that I was thinking in my head. This is a little long, but I had to get all my themes and my motives in there, you know. And anyway, so it basically ends kind of on this abrupt recap, or like, and then it transitions into the epilogue pretty seamlessly, because they were basically supposed to be the same thing from the beginning. The motive from the Toccata returns, and it kind of completes the Arcadia theme. And then we had this big kind of, you know, depressing chorale where the dream dies, the dream of, you know, achieving utopian society. And then from the ashes, we get this big, I call it a, what was it? I think Dr. Hyman called it a love song. And what's so funny about that is it's actually a contrafact on like one of my favorite like J-pop songs of all time. And yeah, and so anyway, so the so there's this kind of like there's this kind of like very melodious section, and then it eventually just kind of fades out. So I guess before, I was gonna just segue right into playing it, but do y'all have any questions before I play it? I know I talked a lot.